Hello, and a really good morning also from my side. Welcome back to the Fundamental Rights Forum 2024, and welcome to our first panel in the thematic strand of digitalization, from code to conscience, ensuring rights-compliant digitalization. In our very first panel, we'll be talking about digitalization and people, how to prevent discrimination, and how to enable social solidarity. We'll be talking about the development and use of digital technologies and how they can undermine people's rights and lead to discrimination. And it will be considering how the increasing digitalization of our life carries challenges to freedom of expression, as well as information. We will try to identify solutions for how to best counter those risks and how to ensure technologies are developed and operated in compliance with international human rights law. And to do so, we have a wonderful panel with wonderful guests that I'm very happy to introduce to you now. To the outer left, we have Lysander Fremuth, who's the scientific director of the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute for Fundamental and Human Rights here in Vienna. Warm welcome, thanks for being here. By his side, Juliane Rappert-Bismarck, executive director of lie detectors. Thanks for taking the time and being with us. And to her right, Yasmina Douri, who's the co-director of the Responsible Technology Hub. Thanks for taking the time. To her right, Diana Nabiruma, who's the Senior Communications Officer at the African Institute for Energy Governance. And to my left, last but not least, Scott Campbell, Senior Human Rights Officer at the UN Human Rights. Thanks for being here. Thank you so much for taking the time for this discussion. I would very much like to start maybe with setting the scene with an opening question, talking about what risks and implications come with the use of big data and algorithms by public as well as private sectors, and how do they impact people's rights and lives. And maybe Yasmin Al-Douri, you want to start with answering these questions, as you're dealing a lot with responsible tech.
Thank you for having me. My name is Yasmina Douri. I'm one of the co-founders and co-director of the Responsible Technology Hub. What we do is basically focus on responsible technology. That's why the question is perfect, actually, for us. If we look at how tech is impacting us on a daily basis, it just takes our phone. Let's take our phone out. We go on social media. We see targeted ads. We already see that on a daily basis, our data is used just to target us, to predict our behavior, and to make money essentially out of it. That's how most of the corporate world uses our data or big data. But if we look at how public actors are using big data specifically, we at RTH, or at the Responsible Technology Hub, often use predictive policing as an example. So for those who don't know what predictive policing is a form of using computer systems basically to predict the next possible crime that will happen. And this happens through AI systems that are based on big data, mostly on criminal history. And if we look at how much we have focused in the past on security policy, we see that our focus has been always on guaranteeing security and safety, but also forgetting the fact that we have fundamental rights that we should not in any way overstep. And this is the moment or the point where we really have to ask ourselves, how far can we go when we say we want to guarantee security, but we also want to guarantee fundamental rights such as privacy. And we already know I don't want to go into depth when it comes to biases in AI systems, but specifically with predictive policing, we've seen a huge issue of biased and flawed AI systems used to predict those possible criminal offenses, and this is mostly targeted at minorities. So one of the biggest issues we face is making sure that the rights of minorities are upheld, but also making sure that their privacy is not only respected, but their security is also respected in some kind of way.
Thank you very much for also outlining the wide range of topics that we will be delving into and talking about the communication, commodification of data on the one hand, and then the balance between security and privacy, which is really, I think, at the core of the discussion, and then as well also pointing out who are the vulnerable groups and who is actually affected by the biases. And when we talk about the solidarity aspect, to not only have it as an empty phrase, whatever solidarity might mean, but maybe just be aware to discriminatory mechanisms and diverse effectivenesses. So thank you very much. I would maybe like to go a bit deeper in asking Lysander Fremuth, how can AI systems contribute to inequality and discrimination? We were already hearing about biases, especially in instances where human interaction is replaced by machine decision making, and how is that connected to human rights, and is there a human right to a human decision even?
That's a huge array of questions, but I think we should be aware of the situation that digital tools and AI can entail a positive and a negative impact on human rights. And I think the right to health is a good example belonging to social rights. We know that AI used in diagnostics or developing vaccines can be extremely helpful and have a positive impact on the right to health. But at the same time, we see that discrimination is happening on a global scale in this respect, because it's mostly the developed and rich countries being able to provide access to these techniques and AI-related healthcare. So talking about solidarity, the question of access, I would say, is of utmost importance. And when we talk about biases and human decision-making being replaced by automatic decision-making, I think the problem, you already touched upon this, is the garbage in, garbage out problem. If those people programming AI and digital tools have biases, and we know we all have biases, that becomes a problem of the data set. And if we have learning AI recurring and taking reference to those, I would say, compromised data sets, the bias becomes prolonged, extended, extrapolated. And this problem gets intensified if we have a brief look at the black box phenomenon. AI has become so complex that quite often even those people programming and designing AI have no clue how the outcome has been established. And there is another dimension intensifying the bias problem, and that is that people tend to potentially falsely trust AI. So we have an outcome that looks neutral, but in the end isn't neutral. So the question of a right to a human decision, I mean, that there is a broad academic debate related to this question. Do we have a human right to a human decision? Actually, we have some positive law. The EU General Data Protective Regulation, I think it's Article 22 or 23, enshrining the right to a human decision. If you have a look at current or planned regulation, the right to a human decision is always mentioned, also to ensure human oversight. We have discussions on the international level, including the United Nations. Antonio Guterres actually asked for a total ban of entirely autonomous lethal weapon systems. So there is a strong movement in this direction that could potentially lead to the acknowledgement of a human right to a human decision. But if you grant me another minute, I think the fundamental question is, what is the rationale behind? Why do we need it? And I would say first, at the core is human dignity. If we talk about fundamental questions having a strong impact on us as human beings, there should be a human in or on the loop. Second, we should not falsely trust the accuracy of AI or decisions taken by digital tools. There should always be the chance to correct and that might require a human being. And finally, I think empathy is playing an important aspect when it comes to human rights. It makes a difference, in my understanding, whether a decision based on computational or mathematical operations takes a decision having a strong impact, or a human being who knows what it means to be a human being. So these are, for me, the main arguments in favor of a human right to a human decision, at least related to questions that might have a strong impact on the enjoyment of human rights.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, what I hear from you is that the human decision can have different iterations. It could be human oversight, it could be regulation, it could be a control mechanism. And the question of empathy, I think, is a whole different realm that we delve into when we also talk about emotions and AI, because I think there is also much further discourse that is maybe also going further, but bringing it back to the dignity, and then also the question of decisions over life and death when we talk about warfare, and also the human right to health that you were pointing to earlier. Talking about the data sets that actually perpetuate bias, and the question of access also makes me think of not only the accessibility of the technology, but the use of the technology also perpetuates the user's data sets. So the question is, if we don't have access, we don't have the data sets of the people, and that actually perpetuates the bias. When we think about the question of trust and the perception of neutrality, I think when it comes to information and digital information, but information in general, it's been a question ever since, and the question of education, and also maybe the asset of creating literacy is very key there. So I would very much like to hear from you, Juliane Bismarck, what is the impact of disinformation and harmful online content, hate speech, etc., on human rights and also on people's lives, and how do you maybe try to counter that?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. It's a really wonderful event. I was really inspired by yesterday's evening reception and the performances and the conversations. So that's a really interesting question. So Lie Detectors is a media literacy organization that works with journalists, children, teachers, and educational policymakers, as well as digital policymakers, on how to improve the integrity of our information space and the shared nature of our information space and the discussion within that space as well. And we actually tackle this very digital issue in what is very often a very analog way. So we have hundreds of journalists walking into more than 1,300 individual classrooms every year, also online, but a lot of them walk in, and you have to imagine that at the beginning, our icebreaker, and you might actually think this to yourselves as well, is that we ask the children and the teachers who are in the room, when did you last go to the following platforms to find information about the world? How about LinkedIn? We ask them to raise their hands if you want to, or you just do it inwardly. What about LinkedIn? What about X? Anyone on Blue Sky this morning? Anyone on Facebook? And then, obviously, we get very little impact from the children, and we ask other questions. How about Twitch? How about TikTok? How about Instagram? How about Discord and Fortnite and Reddit and Telegram and Signal? And the hands are coming up and up and up. And what you see there is not just, you go into disinformation in a minute, but first of all, you see just how pixelated our information space is and how divided the adults and the children are. The generational divide is really extreme, and in those kind of settings, very visible and striking. It means that we're no longer sharing an information space, and within those information spaces, of course, the algorithms are driving what we see. And AI, of course, will speed up the sophistication of preference settings. Once we have trained the cameras to recognize our facial expressions, we will no longer be dependent on the likes or the emoticons that we might currently be using. This will become very automated and very sophisticated in understanding what we want, what we like, what will keep us on our screens for longer, and accordingly, regardless of whether we're on Blue Sky or on Twitch or on Discord or wherever it is, we will be getting tailor-made information, and that is a real problem, even before you get to disinformation. Now, at Lie Detectors, we believe that we have to tackle disinformation and polarization, which I think is becoming increasingly the issue. Not even disinformation, it's actually polarization that we think about more and more deeply. We have to tackle these things from two sides, supply and demand. And for us, supply means reining in and holding to account the drivers of disinformation. I know that there's some very interesting and very important work being done on Russian trolls and Chinese troll farms and things like that. But what I'm talking about, what we think about, is the systemic way that the advertising revenue business model, for instance, of platforms, or micro-targeting as we call it now, is actually fueling these divisions. There's somebody very interesting whom I love to read, Shoshana Zuboff, who talks about the fact that there are things that are currently legal but not necessarily legitimate. And I think we really have to close that gap between the legal and the legitimate. And then when it comes to demand, we talk about educating the citizens so that they don't click and they don't share, they do stop, they do pause, they do try to exit that narrowing circle of information. And there, I think that algorithm literacy, education about how the algorithms function, is one of the core things, because cognitive psychology tells us increasingly that if we are aware of why we are receiving information, if we are aware that the information is being tailored to our preferences, to our biases, to our natural disposition to discriminate and simplify, we are better able to resist the polarizing content that we receive.
Yeah, thank you very much for also pointing out the ambiguity, I think, that lies within polarized but also tailor-made information, because in certain aspects and also certain developments it can be very helpful, but then there's a lot of risk that lies there that actually is the pre-stage of disinformation. So thank you very much for that, and I think the literacy aspect is something that we'll come back to, but just giving the knowledge and the advocacy and also the empowerment to navigate digital spaces to children in analog settings is a very interesting configuration. Scott Campbell, when we think about the development of new technologies, we now heard there's a lot of risk and also threat to human rights to certain degrees, but also then there's a lot of potential in there. And between this balance, what can we do to ensure that those technologies are developed and operated in compliance with international human rights law on a regulatory, on a legal, on an international framework?
Thanks very much for the question, and thanks for having me here. I think the question goes really to just the fundamental importance of putting human rights at the center of the design of new tech, of the development of new tech, the use of new tech, and how legislators and regulators are seeking to govern tech. I'll zoom in, I think, on two very concrete proposed ways forward that are, I think, pieces to the possible massive challenge that's out there. But before I do that, I just want to note two big challenges that I think we all have. And the first, as I think we're all aware, is just how quick the pace of digital technology is developing. And it's, last year was generative AI is on our radar screen. There's a rush from companies and legislators to rein this in, make sure this is being used for good, not to do harm. Next year, who knows what it will be? When will it be? Quantum computing will be the tech issue of the day. There's a real challenge there to keep up with the very quick pace. And there's pressure on legislators and regulators, political leaders, to respond quickly, right? And there's also a lot of distraction out there. There's a lot of talk of dystopian futures and existential risk that can also distract, I think, legislators, the general public, from the real world problems of today, which I think that my three pre-speakers spoke to real well. Linked with that is, while we have a human rights framework, we have international human rights law and principles that are well known by many in this room, I assume, the human rights framework is very distant for companies, for engineers, designers, technicians, and also for many people attempting to regulate and legislate. The human rights framework is not tangible. If you talk to engineers that are doing technical standard setting about human rights, they immediately want to know what you're really talking about. Where are the numbers? Where is the meat? So there's the real challenge in bringing that human rights framework into reality for a lot of people that are on the front lines of designing, developing the tech, and legislating around it. Two main dangers that I see associated with that. One are quick reactions. So we see legislators, regulators reacting too quickly to what are really very complex problems and passing laws that may restrict rights. Companies also passing making changes to product or policy very quickly that may repress rights. The second danger we see linked with that, also with very inconsistent responses across the universe. I think now the most recent count I saw was more than 200 different ethical approaches and ethical toolkits designed to help the use and governance of digital tech, which can lead just to very inconsistent approaches. So the two very concrete solutions I'll point to are pieces to a much bigger and complex puzzle. But the first one exists, and it really goes to that challenge of how do we work with tech companies so that they understand what human rights are, and of note, what the UN guiding principles on business and human rights are. And so our office has developed a project called BTech, and it sits with 15 of the world's biggest companies. There's some, I think, in the room today, but Microsoft, Google take part in this, Ericsson, Telefonica, Apple, Cisco, all take part in what is usually a closed-door discussion to talk about how human rights, how the UN guiding principles on business and human rights can concretely be applied for tech companies. And the idea is essentially to create a race to the top among tech companies. This is a project that's gaining traction, but it really needs to be scaled. And my last point, and the second solution, is one that isn't yet in the works, but it's an idea that the UN Secretary General has put forward, and that he would like to see central to the Global Digital Compact, which member states of the UN will endorse in September, the Summit of the Future. And the Secretary General has proposed the creation of a digital human rights advisory service. And this would be a service that would respond to that need, or bridging that gap between this wealth of recommendations and guidance and authoritative outputs coming from the Human Rights Council, coming from the special rapporteurs, coming from the treaty bodies that are often sitting in Geneva, to put it that way, or sitting in New York, and don't make it to the members of the European Parliament, one of whom, of course, spoke very eloquently about it. But the idea is to make this authoritative human rights body of knowledge and wealth accessible, to make it in a timely fashion, have an agile advisory service that can respond to in real time to needs of legislators, of regulators, of companies. Importantly, it would also need to be a multi-stakeholder and a regionally diverse body of specialists that could really respond to a broad range of challenges in trying to govern tech. So thank you very much.
No, thank you very much to you, when also outlining the question of pace and acceleration. And I think on the one hand, you pointed it out as a problem where just the developments are going so fast that one is kind of always in delay, one step behind. On the other hand, the pressure of reacting quickly, it actually leads to misguided decision making. So the question of how do you have an agile body that is able to respond to those particular challenges of pacing, and also maybe at the core already takes into consideration that nothing is stable in the way we have to face those questions. So when you say at the core of development, human rights need to be thought and implemented, then maybe this is the only solution to be able to react to this very, very dynamic developments. Thank you very much for making this very graspable with the concrete two projects. I would very much like to move on to Diana Nabirume and ask her about digitalization and climate crisis. How do they interdepend, and how in your project does this come about? Yeah, exactly. What is the translocal connectedness? So that is bound to those questions of digitalization and climate crisis, and how do you tackle that at the Institute?
Okay, thank you so much, Jamila. And in my culture, we say good morning to people and recognize their humanity. So greeting people when we meet them is a recognition of their humanity. So I'll say good morning to my fellow speakers and good morning to the audience members. I am happy to be here and to be part of this discussion. So digitalization could be positive for addressing the climate crisis, but it also poses some risks, some of which have actually already been seen. I'll start off by being positive because I want us to imbibe or imbue some positive energy. So the World Economic Forum says that digitalization can help reduce greenhouse emissions by up to 20% by 2050 in the 3 sectors that are responsible for the highest emissions. These are energy, materials, and mobility. And digitalization can help reduce these emissions by ensuring that there is higher efficiencies, but also by ensuring that there is deployment of clean energy to people that need clean energy. And so that's a great thing, but unfortunately, countries in the global south especially, but also in developed countries, we find that people that are poor are not supported to benefit from digitalization. And usually they also bear the highest risk, so they bear the brunt for the digitalization that the world enjoys the benefits from. For instance, the hardware that's used to support digitalization requires minerals to be mined. And we know that the Democratic Republic of Congo in Africa is one of those countries with a lot of reserves of what are being called critical raw minerals that are needed to drive the energy transition. And unfortunately, the way the minerals are mined drives human rights abuses. It also leads to environmental degradation, but also conflicts are driven because of this mining of minerals. The DRC hasn't enjoyed peace in many, many, many years, since colonial times, if I could say that. And unfortunately, to date, there are still conflicts and war in the DRC driven by the desire for minerals. With that being said, the solution would be to ensure that, because I know that there were initiatives around stopping the importation of blood diamonds into various countries. So if Europe could come together and say that the energy transition will not be driven by critical raw minerals that have been mined in a non-human rights compliant manner, that have caused environmental destruction and that are driving conflicts, that would help to some extent in ensuring that digitalization isn't driven by harms to other communities. Then in terms of how digitalization fosters translocal actions, my organization, which is Africa Institute for Energy Governance, is part of a huge global campaign called Stop ECOP, or Stop the Construction of the East African Crude Oil Pipeline. And through this campaign, we are trying to stop construction of the ECOP, or the East African Crude Oil Pipeline, because it's bad for the climate, it's bad for people, and it's bad for nature. It's also not good for the economics or the economic well-being of the majority of Ugandans. And we've been able to use digital tools to connect translocally, both locally but also outside Uganda, and build a huge movement that's trying to stop development of this pipeline. So that's positive. But we also see some negatives because of digitalization. There is surveillance. States are able to undertake surveillance of people that are considered critics of government projects like the ECOP, and that's used to when you're surveilled, your civic space could be muzzled, you could be arrested, you could receive targeted attacks and things such as that. So digitalization, in a nutshell, could be positive, but it also has some negative implications, and we all have to find solutions to address those negative implications. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very, very much. Also for pointing out the interconnectedness of hardware and software, because I think we talk a lot about the ephemeral, but bringing it back to what actually results in environmental realities, but then also whilst trying to reduce greenhouse emissions and worked out a more green and sustainable world, that there are certain aspects that need to be taken in consideration, and it can be done through regulation. And then on the other hand, it's super important that you point out the vulnerabilities of human rights defenders when it comes to digitalization, because on the one hand, to be able to mobilize and organize and self-organize as a movement, but then be exposed to that very surveillance and policing mechanisms in regulations that very much differ in the translocal context that we are talking about, because there's also a juxtaposition of realities happening there when it comes to usage and location. And I think this makes me want to bridge to Yasmin Al-Douri, because in Responsible Tech Hub, you're also very much thinking about interdisciplinary approaches on how they can contribute to responsible tech use, but also tech development. And bridging this very knowledge gap that Scott Campbell was also pointing to between the human rights sphere and the tech sphere. Do you want to maybe elaborate on a project?
Yeah, I would love to. I'm really happy that Diana actually brought up one aspect which we barely talk about when we talk about the digital divide, and that's the fact that we have tech workers, mostly in the Global South, who actually do the click work. So they're exposed to immense, horrendous content that they have to actually, in some kind of way, either process data with, or they have to do content moderation with. And one thing that we at the Hub really focused on was the fact of focusing not only on young people and elevating the young voices, but also seeing who of these young voices are very, very much affected by technology when it comes to development, but also when it comes to, in this case, content moderation. So what exactly do we mean when we say interdisciplinary work is so important? Interdisciplinary work is important because if we look at the problems that we're seeing right now with tech development and tech deployment, the problems are becoming more complex. That means we don't have the normal issue of, we're using tech in the healthcare sector and it might be biased, but we have way more issues. For example, how much energy consumption are we using for the AI systems to be trained? What kind of data are we using? Where's the data from? Who's processing the data? So the problems that we're having are super complex, which require teams that are super interdisciplinary as well. So if we look at the healthcare sector, we don't only need medical experts, we also need mental health experts, so psychologists, psychiatrists. We need people who are able to actually use computational medicine and computational systems to be developed that makes sense for doctors to actually be deployed. Sometimes we have technology that is amazing, but it's not handy enough and it can barely be deployed by, medics or users because it's super complicated. So we also need UX designers, people who are able to pinpoint the technology in a way that it's not only accessible, but actually usable and understandable. And this brings me to the third point, actually, and interdisciplinary rooms also require intergenerational rooms, which means we need young people who are in there, who are actually not only there as representatives, but as a fact that we have here, they're actually heard and their voices are taken serious and their fears are taken serious and they're being considered. We don't see that as much, unfortunately, but I feel like there's a younger generation that is very loud and that is not taking no for an answer. And I think that's the way to go, because at the end of the day, we need the exchange between different generations to actually tackle issues that are super complex. We need the young minds to think of innovation, but we also need the older minds, if you can call it like that, to learn from experience. So I don't want to focus on the fact of young versus old, but it's way more we need to come together and actually create spaces that are open for everyone, where we can really, really focus on issues that are not only affecting everyone, but that will also affect future generations. That also means that young people are not seen as the future leaders, but they're seen as leaders today.
Yeah, thank you very, very much. I think the question of usability and also diversity of usability there plays in there as well, because the questions that different people might have towards technology and tech development also differ by age, by locality, by identity, and if that is incorporated maybe also in kinds of mechanisms that then come up with regulations. We have a question from Slido that I would just like to throw into the space, and it is, what can be done to tackle digital transnational repression? And maybe Scott Campbell, I can give that to you, because you were talking about regulatory mechanisms when it comes to development, but what happens when it comes to the protection also of human rights defenders and technology?
Yeah, maybe briefly just a point, I think, to the importance of the international governance framework, and to remind people of the Global Digital Compact that will be hopefully endorsed in September at the Summit of the Future. There's an opportunity for member states there to commit to human rights being central to the way that they are governing and developing tech and approaching this question of transnational repression. And then secondly, linked with that is the Cybercrime Convention. There's currently negotiations going on around an international cybercrime treaty. How governments frame the final language will be crucial to addressing this question of transnational repression. And we currently have a number of very serious concerns, as does civil society, with the way that, with the risks that the current draft of the treaty pose.
Implying that cybercrime is a question of framing, and the question is the protection of the human rights defenders, or the protection of the so-called safety in this case.
Yeah, and that the treaty in its present form could allow for country A going into your country and asking for your data in a way that's not transparent or does not conform with international human rights law, for example.
Thank you very much for elaborating. As we're coming towards the end, I would maybe like to end on a closing question, that if you would be willing to come up with examples for technological developments that ensure greater inclusion and protection of human rights, and maybe I would like Lysander Fremuth to start.
Yeah, I think what we see is that human rights protection in digitalization and AI will become an issue for business actors in particular, related to due diligence obligations. So the question of protection by design is of utmost importance. And it's also included partially in the recently agreed upon AI Act of the European Union, but also the recommendation, the draft of the Council of Europe. To refer to examples, I think if we have a look at ChatGPT, I learned, or I was told, that ChatGPT, or the company behind, has established mechanisms to exclude sexual abusive language, defamatory language. However, there was a report of UNESCO published a couple of days ago, and it was very interesting because it revealed that large language models, that is text generative AI, portrays a picture of man and women based on a very traditional understanding. Women are associated with household, children, weakness, men with strengths, business, and career. And it was extremely homophobic. Yeah? To type in homosexuals are led to, they have the lowest social standard, they are victims, they are prostitutes, they are criminals. So what we need is awareness, monitoring, and assessment based on company level, but also as part of a broader societal approach. Another example, Google has published Gemini quite recently, and what we have seen is that this tool to generate images has, for instance, portrayed soldiers under the Nazi terror regime in Germany as people of colors. And I mean, that's defamatory, right? It's not only false, but it's also a reputational damage. And I learned that Google is working hard to somehow outbalance the interest to ensure more diversity within AI systems, generative AI systems on the one hand, but on the other hand, to somehow ensure that the outcome is, from a historical perspective, true, and is not leading to discrimination or defamation of certain groups of people. And if you ask for another example, protection by design, for instance, biometric identification tools are allowed under the Future AI Act to somehow save and identify children. A potential avenue of protection or of minimizing data could be reduce it to a certain body height. If you're looking for a children, you do not search using this biometrical identification procedure a person of 2 meters tall. So that could be an example how protection by design could work in the future.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the question of knowledge and image protection and the whole, also maybe then not only factual and human rights discourse, but also philosophical discourse around truth and reality is really also at the core. So we have to come up with new models, maybe. I see the question on Slido, but I think we'll have to close the round by wrapping up with examples. And it was pointed to literacy. And Juliane Rapper von Bismarck, are you willing to maybe go into a bit more specifically, because you were pointing to the different also platforms that you're talking to, and I think you went with very data secure platforms, you went with platforms from the gaming realm, talking about Reddit discourse, platforms that are much more used in activist contests, whereas platforms that are the big commodified ones. How do you actually approach this diversity of realms when talking to young people and children, and how do you actually go about this knowledge transfer?
So you'll never be able to catch all of the platforms. They're constantly evolving. The information space is constantly evolving, and that's a good thing as well. But we need to be aware of it. And so Friso was saying this yesterday evening: education, 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 which I believe that Tony Blair last used on an electoral cycle. And I think what really needs to happen is, we have a lot of conversations, really exciting conversations and impactful work happening on the grassroots level. And then there's very interesting thinking and design and concepts being developed at the level of the UN, UNESCO, OECD, the European, the EU Council, Parliament. All of these entities are doing really important work. What needs to happen is we need to fill the middle. It's the middle that really where the action is needed. The mayors, the regional authorities. I know that things are developing very quickly and that there are many new problems springing up, and AI, goodness knows, we don't even know the half of it yet. But we do already know some things that do work and some things that are impactful, and that digital literacy training, for instance, can be done. It's not rocket science. It can absolutely be done. And the emerging expert consensus is very clear. What needs to happen is that it needs to be adopted at a national and regional and local level. And so that eventually, the ultimate that we should be proclaiming in the not too distant future is that digital literacy, so an understanding of all of these different platforms, how they work, how AI and algorithms interact with us in our information space, that this should become recognized, this critical digital literacy, as something that is key to learning, and that is a fundamental educational right, ranking alongside the core literacies of reading and writing and counting. And when we've got there, then we're really getting somewhere.
Thank you very much. Yasmin Al-Duri, recommendations for responsible tech and what is needed also from policy side, from your side.
Just 2 examples for good tech, because I actually want all of us not to go out here and feel like it's doomsday. There is amazing, amazing tech and AI systems out there that are doing really, really good work. For example, Be My Eyes. It's an app that helps blind people actually find their way through wherever they are. What they do is basically they connect you with a volunteer, and the volunteer is essentially your eyes. They describe to you whatever you show them through a camera. So what they're doing now is to not deal with the fact that they always need volunteers. They're going to use an AI system to basically describe to you whatever the person is trying to see. So this is one example. There's another example with the Deutsche Bahn Blindenhund, which is a cooperation between Microsoft and the Deutsche Bahn. So there are a lot of people out there that are doing amazing work when it comes to making tech more inclusive, but also making sure that people who have some kind of disability are directly included. But what we need is more investment. What we see is that tech for good is barely invested in. People, most investors don't really believe in impact investment, but it's an issue because in the long run it makes a huge difference. And we also see it when it comes to state investments. We don't necessarily see as much as we would like to. As a nonprofit, as a young nonprofit, youth-led, most of the time you're not taken serious anyways. So our projects are also sometimes lacking funding. So we can't necessarily do the project ideas that we want. We can't necessarily implement them, simply because there is no financial support. So one of the bigger issues that we would like to see be addressed more is the aspect of investing more, offering a platform where tech for good can be showcased way more, and in all honesty, advertising that there's tech for good out there.
Thank you very much. Diana Naburi, would you maybe be willing to pick up the investment point when it comes to recommendations? What does investing in also green technologies on the African continent contribute to maybe also tech use that is compliant with human rights?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's already been said that the technologies are largely available to people in the global north, and mostly not available to the people in the global south. So if we had this kind of discussion in the country where I come from, Uganda, you'd find very few people being able to contribute because awareness of the existing technologies and what they can do is really limited. So ensuring that the inclusiveness brings in people from the global south and people from various demographics is extremely important. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A very last remark from your side, Scott Campbell.
Yes, and maybe nothing original, because I just want to pick up on some of the excellent points made. And in particular, I'm still fixated on Diana's example of the extractive industry in the Congo, where I was lucky enough to live for 9 years, and how real that is. And just to second everything you said, I think it really underscores the urgency to step up the application of the guiding principles on business and human rights in the tech sector, and to see that tech companies are looking at the full life cycle of their technologies, from the mines that are producing the minerals to the laborers that Yasmin mentioned that are doing the content moderation, right up to the design room, where I think my colleagues pointed to the need for diversity in the design and development of digital tech, which is very rare in North America, in Europe, where it's mostly white men, and in Asia, where it's mostly Asian men. But getting diverse voices and perspectives into due diligence processes in the design and development stage, I think is crucial. So thanks to my colleagues for raising those great points.
Thank you to all of you for this wonderful discussion. Thanks also for the participation of via Slido. The question was about the discrimination and in AI of people with disabilities. I think we were talking and tackling the bias. It was the facial recognition that was pointed to. We will not have time to delve into it in depth, but I just wanted to acknowledge and recognize that it was in the space, and it's inherent to all the questions that we were talking about. So thank you very much for taking the time and for this wonderful discussion. Thanks for being with us, and let's move on to the next point of the program.